I've loved old houses. As a historian, I started putting that together into architecture instead of just each old house all by itself. And eventually, a number of things have come together. And there are three particular time periods that I'm going to show you pictures from. First of all, from the mid-19th century. This is the time period when we really start seeing a wealth of published material, plans, and home designs. But it's also a time period when architecture is changing because the world around is changing. There's new technologies. And the most important is actually a building technology with the introduction of the balloon frame instead of the heavy post and beam construction techniques. The houses became cheaper, lighter. This is a construction that uses fewer resources because it takes less wood to make the building, but it also changes the way that people think about their houses. There's a change in philosophy that leads to many more people expecting something from their homes that in the early 19th century they apparently still did not expect. One of these things is comfort. If you go back further in history, those grand homes of England and the grand castles of Europe, one thing you can be sure of, they may have been grand, but they were not comfortable. The ordinary American of today has comforts that would have been unimaginable to kings of the past. And even temperature, air conditioning, modern plumbing, all of these change things drastically in terms of the ways people live in their houses. And the changes, some of them actually begin before these advancements are widely available even. Another thing that is becoming expected in the mid-19th century is some sense of privacy. The homes of the American colonial period, even those that had large numbers of rooms, nobody thought anything of it if you had to walk through one bedroom to get to another bedroom, because no one really had that expectation of privacy. If the parlor was also the bedroom of the master of the house and his wife, that was no problem. It simply was the room you put the best furniture in. And whether it was sleeping furniture or whether it was the fancy desk, no problem. So this expectation that individuals could be clean, could be warm, could be private, becomes far more widespread in the 19th century, by the middle of the 19th century. As we move toward the late 19th, early 20th century, there's another shift in architecture. Partly, again, because of technology. By this time period, at least by the early 20th century, not only plumbing, but also the gas first and then electricity will simply drastically change the ways that people live in their homes. But reflected in the house plans that I will be showing you in a bit when I get into each period, also closets. Those bedrooms, you come to be able to recognize a bedroom as a specialized room because bedrooms always have closets. In fact, now that's the definition. If it doesn't have a closet, you really can't call it a bedroom when you're selling your house. And that becomes almost universal by that turn of the 20th century. And then the 1920s, the era after the First World War, which is, I think, in some ways, that period is remarkable as much for what didn't change as for what did change. Because in the 1920s, the overwhelming majority of American homes were still very small. The standard is the 5 or 6 room house, 1 bathroom. Very few homes, though a few did, have attached garages, but for the most part, those changes, things like more electrical outlets, these are in the future still for 1920. And then by the middle of the 20th century, by the 1950s, some more changes that I'm just going to hint at rather than get into will be developing 2-car garages. Nobody builds a house now that's got a 1-car garage. Almost no one builds a home for permanent occupancy now that has only 1 bathroom. 1920s, almost nobody built one that had more than 1. Only the very largest of homes would have more than 1 bathroom. So that's where I'm going with all of this. And in the final historical tradition, I will start at the beginning with the mid-19th century. And with one of these books. This particular one is from 1869. Its original title was Woodwards National Architect. So it was published. It has drawings, not photographs, of homes. It has their plans. Quite elaborate, this particular one. 1 big bedroom, 1 medium-sized, 2 very tiny bedrooms here at the back of the 2nd floor. A parlor, a dining room, and a kitchen. Again, the fact they're defining a room as the dining room is pretty significant. Because earlier on, most houses, the rooms were multi-purpose. And they probably still are in this time period, but they're calling them by names at least. But this particular book also gives all of the construction details. You could take this book, look at all of these fancy things, and go build yourself a house, or get a builder to build you a house according to those plans. The goal of the architects who are selling them, of course, is always that you will get them to come and do the plans for you. But it's an interesting concept when you figure that before this time, most houses were simply designed by the people who built them, according to the expectations that people had of their houses. This is actually one of the most famous of the architecture books, Andrew Jackson Downing. And Downing actually has a fascinating 19th century story too. He died in 1852, I believe. This book was published just shortly before his death. If any of you have ever read Huckleberry Finn, remember that raft trip? And one of the things that often gets that book banned in school libraries, when he's reporting that there was a steamboat explosion, and the woman, whose name I forget, probably Aunt Polly, asked him if anybody was hurt. And he said, "No, ma'am, killed a nigger." And the word, of course, being offensive to 21st century ears, as it should be, is enough to get it banned, even though in the 19th century context, that is certainly the word that would have been used in Missouri. It's a steamboat accident in which Downing lost his life. He and his wife were taking a cruise on the river, and 2 steamboats were racing with each other. And this technology of the mid-19th century was still pretty dangerous. They raced and raced and raced, and the Henry Clay got going so fast that it lighted stuff on the deck on fire, and people were jumping off the boat into the water. And reports differ on how Downing himself was last seen. By one report, he was last seen on deck throwing deck chairs to people in the water. so that they could float until help came. Another report is that just before he went down for the last time, he was last seen helping a woman and child rescuing other people. But either way, he ended up drowning because of a motor vehicle accident of sorts on the river. But before that, he was 37 or something like that at the time of his death. But he had already published several books, of which this is my favorite. Partly because of plans, partly because of what it says. And what it says, as architecture does, about the society. This is a simple little house, a cottage rather than a villa in his language, but it is one that he explains. This room here, it has a parlor, a living room, a kitchen, and a bedroom on the first floor. And Downing explains this because clearly he expects someone to say, why have you put a parlor, which was a room that was set aside for visitors? This is a room that is special. Why would you put a parlor in a little house for a cottager, for someone who has no wealth? And he says, we have given a parlor to this cottage, though in most cheap cottages, the living room is virtually the parlor, because we think that in a cottage with so much accommodation as this, there should be one apartment of superior character. The American cottager is no peasant, but thinks, and thinks correctly, that as soon as he can afford it, he deserves a parlor where he can receive his guests with propriety, as well as his wealthiest neighbor, and that quintessential American sense of, I'm as good as anybody else, in my house as well as in everything else about me, really, I think, comes through in that quote, and in a real sense in this design too, because it's a very simple little house, stripped down, and yet it's got everything, almost everything that you can expect in the 1850s. Here's the upstairs plan of it, with even, you notice, closets in all of those bedrooms. Because of the plan in the house, there was a place to put them. So Downing and his plans, many of which are much more elaborate. This is a villa in a pointed style that he designed. So you can see, once you get wealthier, there are some very significant changes. That's the floor plan, much more than just a parlor. Here we have a drawing room, a library, a boudoir, a dining room, and a bedroom, all on the first floor. Notice what there's not. There's not a kitchen. Because, of course, larger houses assume that you're going to have servants for the kitchen. In his upstairs, again, notice what's missing. This is a significant sized villa that assumes that there will be servants in the household. It does not have a bathroom. That was desirable by this time, but by no means, even for a house of this character, was it necessary for anyone to provide a bathroom for the population that lived there. Here's another of these early architects. Calvert Vaux was actually, for a brief time at the end of Downing's life, he had a partnership with Andrew Jackson Downing. You can guess who Andrew Jackson Downing was named after, by the way. But Downing's death put an end to that. He actually got into a log house. Essentially, as he says, this is not a log cabin, not the kind of log cabin where everybody's sort of pigs lovingly together in one room and you cook and eat and sleep and dress all in one room. This is a log house for a well-to-do and presumably cultured settler in some wooded area, that besides the living room, which is kitchen, dining room, living room, parlor all together, there's a sink room for the dirty work of the kitchen, a storeroom, and 2 bedrooms, so that in fact you get that privacy that has become something that people seek by this time. He also designed many more. This is still, according to his terminology, this is still a cottage, just a little house for some poor family. Clearly, his determination of who is poor varies a little from some people's. This one actually has a kitchen on the first floor. Many of Vaux's plans do not. They have the kitchen in the basement. Downing always puts them on the first floor. Not always. Most of the time, Downing puts them on the first floor, and Vaux puts them in the basement. This one, though, has the kitchen, parlor, dining room. Does have a bedroom on this floor. When we look at the plans of the second floor and the attic, go over so we can see them. Again, no bathroom. This is a substantial residence, but does not have a bathroom that's included in it. Not because the technology wasn't there, but because, of course, the technology was still expensive. This one, finally, this very substantial dwelling with, on the first floor, a drawing room, dining room, library, bedroom, and this pantry or back hall here, has this tiny little room off the back entrance. That's a water closet. A first floor lavatory, in a half bath in modern terms. And again, finally, when we get to the second floor of this house, he gives the basement and attic and roof plans as well. But back in that space, there is a room that's labeled bath and water closet. It hardly looks big enough to me to put a permanent bathtub in, but they did make small ones. So it is something that's still in the 1850s, reserved for people who are considerably above the average in terms of their income. Finally, for this time period, this particular big fat book, Sloane's, originally it was called the Model Architect. Dover gives new names to the books sometimes. And Samuel Sloane, in roughly the same time period, had a little more imaginative approach to both the inside and the outside of homes. This is his design of an Oriental villa. At least he didn't say that it was a plain dwelling, but yeah, no, he didn't call it a cottage either, you're right. Its plan, it's not quite as exuberant as the home itself. This is the first floor, but it's still pretty interesting. Again, he has the water closet here, and on the second floor, he has not only another water closet, but also a good-sized bathroom where you could, one that many other architects might have called a bedroom, in fact. If you look at those bedrooms, again, you'll notice most of them do not have closets. So this is not yet seen as a crucial element. Yes?
Excuse me, for the bedrooms are labeled bedrooms, but
Oh,
what are chambers?
A chamber is a bedroom.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's just bigger, obviously.
Yeah. In a house like this, that had, well, this one actually, if you look at this, you can sort of see on there those little round circles under the eaves. Those are windows. This house had third floor rooms, so the rooms for the servants would have been in the attic with those almost invisible windows. Even in a real dwelling, they're so small and so shaded by the eaves that they don't show up. That's why they're made like that. But there are rooms behind there. But if it were simply 2 stories, then in that position would be where they put the servants' rooms. Given that they have other ones, they probably put kids there. Not such a bad idea. And occasionally, Sloan also will give the directions, essentially. He's showing here the framing of this house so that his designs can be used to actually explain to someone how you would build such a place. His most interesting design, I think, is one that you may actually have seen before. It's rather a famous example. It's another Oriental villa, but this one is an octagon. You can see that much more clearly if you look at the plans. This lower one is the plan of the first floor of that building. And then the second floor, I believe that's actually built. They actually built up these rooms to the second floor because I've seen photographs that have it going up higher. This is incredibly imaginative for a house in this time period. It actually was built in the South, and the Civil War, of course, came along before it was even finished and occupied, I believe. It never was occupied as a private dwelling, but it was planned as a private dwelling. Even this incredibly exuberant and very, very large dwelling has, on the second floor, a bathroom and a water closet. There's another water closet in the basement. And that's seen as absolutely sufficient plumbing. After all, why would you need any more than that? Well, the Civil War, of course, does change things in the United States, and the period that comes in the late 19th century, the 1880s, 90s, and the first decade and a half or so of the 20th century will be significantly different. I think the biggest difference is that plumbing has become almost essential in that time period. You'll find very few homes being built by the 1890s that have no plumbing at all in them. Any homes that you would make the designs of, at least. The only ones in the pattern books are either extremely small homes for industrial workers, or they are vacation homes. So they're out someplace where you can't get the water pressure that you need. By this time, if you can't get the water pressure in town, what you do is you have a tank in the attic. Many old houses actually have a metal-lined room in the third floor. And the way that it worked was you have a pump someplace, and a servant or a son or someone like that will every day simply pump it to make sure you've got enough water in that tank to give you the water pressure that you need. They also will often fill from the roof so that it can be set up so that water which runs off the roof runs not down to the ground, but rather into this tank on the third floor. A sort of good use of nature to get what you want. But they still generally have only that one bathroom, even if there are 2 floors. This book, excuse me for not telling you, this is George Barber's Cottage Souvenir. This is a photograph of the house, and this is the elevation drawing of the same house. And Barber's explanation of this. This is a house of ample and convenient room, compact and well proportioned, of rather plain design. So it shows these changing standards of what is excessive decoration, I think, that most of us would probably not call that a rather plain design, and yet by the time we get to the 1920s, there will be homes that we might describe that way. But this points out that even by this time period, at around the 1880s and 90s, this is 1891, this particular book, as an ideal, if not perhaps as a reality, a simplicity of design is coming to be important. Another thing that sets Barber apart from most of the others is that he's located in and works out of Knoxville, Tennessee. He is not a northerner. Most of the others, they're upstate New York, they're Chicago, and because of this, he will make some of his designs in two versions. One for a southern and one for a northern usage. Of course, we go back far enough, and even into the 19th century, even very small southern houses were different, not sharecroppers' houses. They didn't generally have much in the way of amenities, but the homes of others were likely to have a separate kitchen. Even a one-room house, a one-room shack somewhere, probably had an even smaller shack that served as a kitchen to keep the heat of the kitchen activities out of the main house. Well, by the 1890s, Barber rarely, only one of the plans, does he actually put the kitchen separate from the house, and even then there's a porch connecting them. But for his southern plans, there usually is a hallway, more of a hallway than here. Before you get back to the kitchen, there's a hallway that completely cuts off that part of the house from the rest of the house. There's also an expectation that still prevails in the north as well, but is even greater in the south, that much of the work of the household is going to be done by servants. This house provides a servant's room, so that you've got, again, it is separate from the rest of the house, separated by that back hallway with the stairway in it, so that you won't be accidentally bumping into the maid as she goes about her daily activities. So here is another plain house. This one, I think it's a little less humorous that Barber refers to this as a comparatively plain design. And remember that all of these works, although as a single volume, they're published at the same time, they're not all designed at the same time. It is quite likely, given the style of it, that this particular building came later than that first one. Again, the elevation drawing to go with that perspective. And the same things. Notice there's a back porch here. Because when we get to the 1920s, I'm going to have a point about back porches that is different from this. But most of these houses have two doors somewhere, one for the front and one for the back. The servants, anybody with dirty feet, being expected to use that rear entrance, not at all a bad idea. In fact, many homes today are designed with a mudroom, sometimes in very recent, very elegant designs. It's as big as a room, in fact, to achieve that same purpose. Again, the exterior of this house is rather plainly finished. Seems to me maybe you could have saved yet a little more money by leaving off a tad of the gingerbread here and there, but in the 1890s, this is what passes for a large but plain design. There's also, in the plan of this building, here's a place where you can see that hallway going all the way across. This is the design for the southern audience. This room here is the bathroom on the first floor in this house. Because there's a bathroom on the first floor in this house, you will not see one on the second floor. A two-story house, it's quite common to have a bedroom on the first floor, but you will either have a bathroom on the first floor or a bathroom on the second floor. It's very rare to have both of those. Of course, when these houses are restored, people will, if they're actually going to live in them, will often find some way that they can sneak in a few more facilities here and there. Now this, I actually picked this book to bring because you're probably sick of looking at black and white, and this one actually has some color plates, including one of my favorite houses. So you can see this one, just because it's my favorite. That is one of Henry Hudson Holly's. This particular one is 1890, so it's just about the same time period. Again, it is not precisely a plain dwelling, but I just like the way that all the volumes and the shapes fit together in that particular house. But there also are some. This one I want first to show you just the picture of the house. Look at it well. It looks like that must be a pretty large house, right? When we get it all the way up where you can see that house plan, this is a 6-room cottage. It's got 3 bedrooms, a bathroom, a kitchen, dining room, and parlor. Many of these houses have give an impression of being much larger than they actually were because of the massing, the way that they're put together. There are some major changes in that early time period. One of them, the bungalow. Bradford is hardly, despite the title here, he's not one of the most artistic of bungalow architects. He will design in any style anyone will buy his plans in, and he did design in many, but it's interesting. Now that's a plain dwelling. It's very different from the earlier styles, and generally the bungalow style will have less of that applied decoration. Occasionally, especially when they get into the Spanish, it'll have a fair amount of it, but they tend to be small. Now there's one that I would say is a fairly decorated building in this book, but he's trying to make that one artistic, and I think it's a less successful design because of that. These, again, they're very small dwellings, really, that he's designing, and designing them for ordinary people. But there's another movement in the early 20th century, the Craftsman movement, that really sets the stage for a lot of what's going to happen later with American architecture. The Craftsman Ideal has to do with doing things by hand, moving away from machinery and into an artistic ideal. Nonetheless, I'd say that's a pretty traditional looking English cottage. Hardly anything that is majorly new. Is that a word? No, that's not a word. But it is a craftsman type of building. The craftsman buildings often have things like sunrooms, sleeping porches. They will feature those as important They'll feature, in fact, outdoor living as a part of the design. And here's one house that shows that. This outside kitchen, from the fact that it also has a door to the dining room, suggests it's also an outdoor dining room. This is, in fact, a porch that's meant to be used, and it's at the back of the house, not at the front of the house. So this is one shift that really is pushed, not just in the stylistic aspects of that Craftsman Ideal, but in the practical sense of what we're going to see later on. Now, I think most of us would expect to see some provision in a house plan for connection between the home and the outside, but we expect it to be in the private area of the backyard, not that great big front porch. That particular house had both of them. This is a very interesting book. It falls into this time period. It's actually the 1870s and 80s. But this particular one and this house, which is, this book's too big to fit on the document camera. There's the perspective of the building. And then as you can see by all those rooms, even though they're not all that large, this is a big house. Again, it's a big house with one bathroom on the second floor, even though there's a bedroom on the first floor. They did give the bedroom a sink, however, so that you can at least brush your teeth without having to walk upstairs. As long as all you have to do is brush your teeth before you go to bed. But Palliser is the first of the plan book makers to actually design through the mail. The others, they're sold. You can try to build these designs. The first two, Downing and Vaux, they weren't meant for people to copy, but rather meant to inspire people, maybe to raise people's standards of their artistic sense. But Palliser actually wants people to write to them and say, these are the conditions that I have where I'm going to build a house, and this is the design I like, and will you make me plans for this? And they'll do it through the mail. In that way, it is sort of a transition to the 1920s. Because in the 1920s, many of the books that are published, as this one is. Once again, a few color pictures for you. This one is by the Morgan Company. They sold lumber. So they want you to build one of their houses because they want you to buy their lumber and hardware and everything to build it with. It also, although most of these houses are in traditional styles, this one, I think, except for the roof line, ignore the roof line for the moment, and without that pitched roof line, it actually is reminiscent of some of Wright's Prairie style houses. So it's picking up on some of the material that was there in earlier time periods, but it is also interesting that it remains true. You see a house like this, there's a nice one-story cottage. If you get a house larger than 6 rooms, almost all of them are 2-story houses. So when you get bigger than, really when you get much bigger than this house, which is simply a 2-bedroom house, you get 3-bedroom ones that have one story. Beyond that, they get taller rather than getting bigger. And in fact, this book, which is 500 Small Houses of the 1920s, compiled by Henry Atterbury Smith, so this architect compiled all of these home designs. About half of them, in the first part of this book, about half of them, 2 to a page, are 6-room houses. 6 little 6-room cottages. Most of those are in fact 1 story. So toward the end of the book, after presenting a bunch of 3, 4, and 5-room, even smaller cottages, they get into the bigger small houses, I suppose. The 7 and 8-room houses. In some ways, the format of the book, very similar. You still have 2 houses per page. But in that 7 and 8-room section of this book, there is exactly one 1-story house. And that one, the text starts right out saying, this is really a 6-room house. They're counting a sleeping porch in order to make it a 7-room house and put it in that section. Again, this is rather different from what we would see today, where many houses get significantly larger than and still are spread out on 1 floor. Where a lot of people, even wanting a great deal of space and a great deal of luxury, still do not want to have to make it, don't want to have to climb stairs. This one, again, in the 1920s, very ordinary little house in some ways. It has a breakfast nook. This house would, of course, have outlets in most of its rooms for electricity. A small house might only have one for a ceiling light. Wouldn't necessarily have plugs. They're just making the transition to our kind of technology that still sort of works today. But through this book, and the company also sold all of its lumber, so they've got all of this stuff they want to sell you. But from that we get to yet another, in the 1920s, really new kind of production of houses. Some of you have probably shopped at Sears, right? Well, from the early 20th century, you could buy house plans from Sears, and you could buy everything that it took to build that house. But by the 1920s, you can buy what is essentially a prefabricated house, some assembly required, because it comes in the big the bundles of lumber, but it is all pre-cut. It is all marked. You put it together. The companies that offer this kind of service claim it takes that. First of all, you get your materials cheaper because of the economies of scale, and it takes maybe half the man hours to put it together. So you save drastically on the labor, you save on the materials, you get a better house for less. And some of these houses, think of early prefabricated houses as being some little, just a tiny little thing, but the Lexington here, I think, the Lexington could hold its own with non-prefabricated homes of its era. A 4-bedroom, 1.5 bath. This house actually has, in the back corner of the first floor, another bathroom, or a half bath at least. And, it's a large house. They tried to make it attractive, to make it very typical. None of these prefabricated houses are going to be avant-garde in any way. But nonetheless, here we have, in the 1920s, a little late, a sort of Craftsman Bungalow with six rooms and 1 bathroom. An attic, it does have an attic. There are many of these different companies that are selling houses. The Aladdin company is the most famous of them. Aladdin was actually the first of the companies, I think, to sell them. They argue that you can build it in a day, and of course you have to have your foundations and everything ready before that. But it actually, I think until about 10 years or so ago, it was still, Aladdin was still in operation. And there are, in fact, to this day, places that you can buy a log house, everything marked and ready to put together. And like most of these, that house is not going to be on the cutting edge architecturally, but in terms of what they offer for comfort. Many of these houses are on the cutting edge because what it means that all this is available is that it becomes much cheaper. It's really part of the same trend that after World War II results in the Levittowns, because more people can afford a home with that minimal level of comfort with, by the 1920s, electricity, with gas for cooking and heating, with plumbing, and even in the small compass of those homes, it is meaningful, I think, that they've got that. Nonetheless, it remains true in the 1920s, based on these catalogs, that there are a lot of homes being built with only 2 bedrooms. Not very many being built, in fact, with more than 3 bedrooms. So the expectation of privacy probably exceeds the reality of privacy that's available in them. And in fact, probably the same thing is true for comfort. If you think about, now jumping forward another 30 years or so, after the Second World War to the 1950s, an era when all around us here at Mesa, there are houses that were built then. In Linda Vista, in Claremont, this is when these areas opened up, during and after World War II, so 1940s and 50s. By that time, an attached garage is almost seen as a necessity. But the basic house in 1950 was still in roughly the 1,000 square foot range. I live in one of those houses, and it's about 900 square feet for a 3-bedroom, 1-bath house with a 1-car attached garage. It is not very big for a family of 4 to live in. But some other things have changed too. Porches. Those big front porches have, except where it's attached as a stylistic necessity to make a colonial house, for instance. Front porches are rarely there. Almost every house is going to have instead some kind of deck or patio in the back if it's built since the 1950s, because the household activities came to be seen as part of that private realm of the household. On the other hand, many of those 1950s homes considered it quite sufficient to be wired for built-in light, perhaps, and if they had 2 outlets in a bedroom. 2 outlets don't go very far when you're trying to plug in a computer, in case anyone has ever tried to do that. It is one sign of how different those houses were from those that are being built in the 21st century. But the biggest sign of that is simply the sheer size of the more recent construction. Now, a 2,000 square foot house is a small house. The average size of new construction, which is actually going down a bit right now, that had gotten up, I think, to about 2,500 square feet for the average new construction. The size of the master bedroom, none of those plans that I showed you really had a master bedroom. Certainly none had a suite with a bathroom attached. One of the bedrooms might be bigger than the others, but they would still be quite small by many modern standards. I'd like to finish up with a couple of homes from this catalog, which I think, from the fact, the way it's falling apart, I probably bought it in the 1990s somewhere. First of all, it's got some old designs perhaps, but here we have a 768 square foot, 2-bedroom, 1-bath house that could easily have been built in the 1950s. And then, one that is perhaps a little more recent. The colonial style of it could have been done anytime. But if you look at the plans, this really isn't a very big master bedroom right here in this front corner. But look at its closets and bathroom. The closets and bathroom put together are bigger than the living room, bigger than the family room, practically as big as the garage. And that is very characteristic of plans that are being, of homes that are being designed today. That they see that really quite elegant master suite as a necessity. And I think that's a sign of how the desire for comfort and privacy, in fact, has gone, maybe even gotten a little bit out of control, as suggested by the fact that our homes have gotten larger and larger while the average American household at the same time has gotten smaller. But I think it's the end of a story, and of course the beginning, as for historians, the present moment is always the beginning of a new chapter that somebody else can deal with some other time. Thank you. If any of the students who are here need to leave at this time, this would be, or anybody else, of course, if you need to leave, this would be a good time to do it. And does anyone have any questions? Yes, Judy.
Are there any differences between the southern and northern styles beyond the detached kitchen?
I think there are, at least as you get into the 18th century, the southern houses often have that big hallway.
Right.
I mean, even if sometimes the smaller houses might have an open breezeway, but that huge stair hall that goes through the southern colonial homes, that's picked up, in fact, in the plan books by a lot of northern houses later. It evolved as an adaptation to the southern climate. They also tended to have significantly higher ceilings. And as we get into the second half of the 19th century and onward, southern houses are far less likely to have central heating. They don't need it. Instead, they are far more likely to have fireplaces in most of the rooms because they need that occasional response to cold instead of needing to deal with the whole season of cold the way the northern houses do. So there certainly are some differences. Also, I think there's differences simply because the South, until quite recently at least, remained more rural and the North was more urban. And so that it was a farmhouse and a very different style of farming than was found in the North, and so a different style of farm housing as well. I think that in the 20th century, the differences have become less and less. I really do. So that it's only occasionally now that you'll see in a description of a plan that someone is saying this is particularly appropriate for Alaska or this is particularly appropriate to Florida. They seem to treat beach houses as though it doesn't make any difference whether it's a beach in Florida or in California. But there are still some regional architectural styles. You know that the Northwest has this shingle house style that you really don't find much of any place else. And in the early 20th century, California had some rather peculiar differences from the rest of the nation. But then, it's California. Yes,
Two questions, Mary. The
well, I
first,
only have one answer to it.
all right. Was there any particular or unique style to Amish and Mennonite homes as opposed to others? My second question, we've heard about barn raisings. Did they ever have house raisings prior to prefab?
They certainly the Amish and Mennonites, they started out in a German tradition of building. And I think, though, that it became rather like, we're talking 19th century, rather like the styles around them. But that was because many of those German techniques that have been introduced in the 18th century will sort of find their way into the larger architectural community.
So they didn't have plain folks' homes as opposed
Well-
to Victorian.
They definitely had ones that did not have the ornament.
Right.
I mean, anyone that won't put buttons on their clothes because it's vain is probably unlikely to go to Sears and buy a verge board that's all gingerbread and put it on their house. So their dwellings would have reflected that, and they would have been made within their community. But so were a lot of non-plain folk homes built within their community, to segue into the other question. Yes, they did occasionally simply get together and build. In fact, in the suburban areas of the industrial cities, it wasn't particularly uncommon, it was sort of a form of social security, for a family during their working years to buy a little piece of land and put up a house so that when they could no longer work, they would have a place that they could live, and sometimes they'd even put up a double-decker and then they could rent out one floor while living on the other. And they're often building those themselves, which means, even now, building something yourself usually means providing beer and pizza for all of your relatives and friends and getting everybody over to help you out there. It's not usually a real formal thing. Where you clearly see it as a formal thing is in frontier areas, when people depend on that shared labor. So there it was just expected that if somebody needs a log cabin put up, they will get the wood ready. But of course it takes more than one man to lift them logs onto each other. Then the community would come around and help put them up. It's expected, it's even sort of demanded, and people agreed with it because they know that that means that they're going to be able to ask for the reciprocity when they need that kind of assistance. But most of the construction in the United States seems to have been done by others, or at least supplemented by others. And the more technology you get in there, the more that's true. A house that somebody built with their own hands today would never be up to code, unless your friends happen to include an electrician and a plumber, and you're going to need a pretty wide range of building trades in your acquaintance with a lot of equipment in order to be able to make anything now that there are zoning restrictions in most places. So it's really before zoning restrictions that was even a possibility. And some people did do it. Yes?
And that raises a question I just thought of. When did communities begin to have zoning regulations? And, when did it stop being, kind of do your own thing? And
Well, I know that some of the new suburban areas of Atlanta in the 1870s you weren't allowed, I think it was in Inman Park, you couldn't, for 30 years when it was first opened up, for 30 years you weren't allowed to have any commercial stuff there. So you couldn't have a corner grocery or anything within the limits of that subdivision. Some of it actually, of course, it's tied to racial restrictions. That kind of zoning, which was very, very common in northern cities where they couldn't depend on custom to keep undesirables out of the neighborhoods. They would simply have it written into the contracts. But a lot of it, in many places before, really I think up until the mid-20th century, in many areas it depended on custom more than on law. But still there were some regulations, more and more in the 20th century, that you had to be hooked up to the sewers, for instance, because it was seen as a health hazard if you had an outhouse out back. Probably rightly so. So I don't know when they first appeared at all, but certainly from very early on, within the early 19th century anyway, in cities and towns, you saw like buildings being built near each other. You didn't see a shanty being put up next to a mansion, even though perhaps you could have. And I think in those cities that had row housing, they had rules about how far back the houses had to be set, which is what accounts for the rather flat facade of many houses in a row. Yes?
So, there's a bunch of them you showed that said, you could build yourself, with a certain robot thing, which is beyond me, but, so what, if you were going to hire somebody, when did it start to be like where you would just hire one company or one group of people and they come and do it, and to get to the point where you had to have like several different, like a plumber, and how it's like
Well,
subcontracting.
maybe it goes all the way back to the beginning in the 1630s in Massachusetts. You just hired one carpenter, one construction person, and told him roughly how big you wanted the house, and he would come and build it. I think, what you're asking me is, when did it get to be companies that hire all these people themselves and do the whole?
Yeah, or it gets parted out into various,
Yeah.
You might have more than one company involved.
I think as soon as it got as complex as it did. Once you're dealing not only with people who can build the frame of the house and put the skin on it on the inside and the outside and stick the windows in, but also with the people who can seal it up and the people who can put in the plumbing and the people who can do the electrical and the people who put in the gas lines, the dangers of doing it wrong become greater and greater. And we don't think of plumbing as being something that will go wrong and destroy your house. But boy, in the late 19th century they did. There are all sorts of stories in Palliser, little asides about times when someone didn't do the plumbing right, and therefore everybody in the family died of typhoid the next week, or didn't set up the ventilation system right, and the germs got in, and again, everybody died. So I think a lot of it is that perception, and it's largely true, that no one is going to be an expert in all of these things. And that you really need to have them all done up to a certain minimal standard, and the only way to do that is with subcontractors. Or with a giant company that actually hires them all. Yes?
One other thing I noticed in the progression of your books is that it looks like an example of the democratization of sort of a gentry ideal or a certain kind of upper class ideal of houses that appears to be, at least in relative terms, made more accessible in the 20th century. And so I guess and the implication being that the gap between, like in the 18th century, between a very, very nice, in Europe, a colonial mansion versus a cottager's cabin, that gap has narrowed.
Well, maybe, but that 768 square foot house is in the same book as this one.
Yeah.
So, I think there certainly is, a spread downward of the ideals, because even in the early 20th century, it's really one of the things that defines being middle class is to even have the aspiration of homeownership. And as homeownership became in fact more widely available, we can see it that the vast majority, journalists have actually done this, taken a microphone out and asked 100 people what class you are, and almost all of them say that they're middle class. People who have $750,000 a year say, I'm not rich. It's people who have $1.5 million a year who are rich. And people who are making $30,000 a year, which in San Diego doesn't take you very far, still consider themselves to be middle class. And I think that what we're looking at in the early, for instance, in the 1850s, that first set of books that I used, is an expectation that people who a generation before would have lived in pretty much undifferentiated housing. Buildings that had 1 or 2 rooms and a loft above them really ought to be able to have something that is correctly proportioned and looks attractive and is more comfortable, more convenient, and where they can get that privacy. So certainly those ideals are available first to the wealthy, and through that they come to be expected by people well down the road. And even the technology, 1908, electricity, which was much more convenient than gas or oil lights, was only for the wealthy. By the 1920s, even people who lived out in rural areas would often make their own electricity because they saw it as so necessary to have electricity, to have that kind of power. So in that sense, clearly there's a democratization of expectation that's going on. And much of the time it's actually met.
I have a couple of questions. One is a follow-up to this discussion about the democratization boom. Some of this had to do with availability of mortgages, right? I wonder when that started. Because people, the price tag $4,500, that would have been an enormous sum at the time. And certainly when people had access to credit and mortgages, this really began to make this more possible.
Yeah, and that really is a 20th century thing.
Yeah, right.
In the early 20th century, the building and loan associations were, they were not like our modern loan things, but everybody would put stuff in and you'd sort of draw lots for who got to get the money out and make their house first. But the expectation was that you would build what you could afford when you could afford it, that you would save up the money first,
Right.
and then you would, and I think it's really obvious. By the 1920s, in fact, that's pointed out in some of those homes through the mail catalogs. The easy payment plan, you could get everything from Sears on an easy payment plan.
So Sears would finance it themselves, sort of.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, and not just for homes, but for clothes and, maybe not clothes, but for furniture
Sure.
that you bought from the Sears catalogs. You could buy it, $1 down and with $5 down, $5 a week for a set of furniture. They would actually give, in advertising it in the 1920s catalogs, they would give that payment plan for large purchases.
Did they charge interest on that?
Yes. And I added them up once, and it would certainly end up costing more if you bought it on a time plan than if you paid for it in one.
So, and the land though can't be. That was one thing that how easy was it to get loans to buy the lot?
To get loans for it, you just couldn't do that.
Yeah, that's what I think.
You saved up your money. And many people, because of that sense that this is what this is what gives you that middle class respectability, a lot of people actually did that. But many will find themselves, naturally enough, having to buy cheap land. It's difficult. In many of the major cities, the home ownership rate, of course, is very low. In New York City, by the early 20th century, they did one survey, of the living habits of the working class, and they actually threw out the 2 or 3 people that they found who owned their homes, because they said, these are clearly weird people who don't belong in our sample, or they would be renters like all normal people are in New York City, which I think is still pretty much true in New York City. But in smaller cities around the country, people in fact did buy the cheap land on the outskirts of town. You could still get it pretty cheaply. Even in the 1950s, clearly, you could still get land that was out of in San Diego even, that was out of the settled areas. If you don't believe that, I don't have any pictures, but look at the lot sizes in some of those houses in Claremont. Just cheaply built, tiny little dwellings, those duplexes that line Claremont Mesa Boulevard. They have these vast lots between them. Today, anybody in their right mind would put up at least one more building in the space in between those. That's just given up to front yards. And the reason they did that was because land was really cheap at the beginning of the 1950s when they were putting up those duplexes. So that's what most people would have to do. And that's why they often did buy the land. They'd save up to buy the land, and then they'd have to save up again to be able to afford the materials, even if they were putting up the building on their own. Yes?
That's what my mother did. She was building in the mid-1950s in San Diego, and she was a teacher and professional, and she was trying to get a loan on her through her own name, not related to her husband, and the banks would not loan to her. They said that she had to have her husband apply for the loan. So my mother saved up money and did it in stages.
Built the house in stages?
Yep.
How
Bought the
long did it
land
take?
and then she finished, I think she bought it in 54, 55, and it was done. She moved in about 58. She's still there.
Oh, well, good.
So she built it right when she finally got done.
Yeah. So my other question was about front porches.
Mm-hmm.
I've just been sort of writing about. So talk about when they start falling off the plan, right? The shared space then moves around to the back of the house and no longer sort of.
Yeah, I think first it starts to shrink in the front of the house.
Yeah.
But the Craftsman Homes and the bungalows, they usually, in the 1920s, they usually still had that big front porch.
Yeah.
It's really by the time that you get to the 1940s, 50s, and actually maybe even a little earlier, it may be the influence of the modern style, which of course is now a classic style like everything else, but which really spread in the 1930s in the United States. Most of those buildings did not have a front porch. A front porch was much too traditional.
Yeah.
If they had anything at all, it was going to be a covered area in the backyard, in the private space.
Yeah, I was wondering if you thought it had to do with privacy.
I think it definitely does. In the 1950s, there's a big family togetherness movement. And, of course, the television really aided it. As families get TVs, they sit around and watch them together. But the focus of it really was not on doing stuff with your family in the outside world, but in your own private space. And that's when you started getting a lot of the backyard barbecues and stuff. And if you're going to do that, then you need patio in the backyard. Yes?
And I would also guess that it might be a product of the advent of the automobile. I'm thinking of my grandparents' home, where everybody would walk to the store, and so the grandparents would sit on the front porch, and you would socialize as people walked by. Now you get these stinky, noisy cars that are driving by and nobody walks by anymore, so there's no reason to sit on your front porch because everybody's zipping by and making noise and, you know, pollution. So you move back to the back side of the house.
It could be, and yet, on my street, where the houses were all built in 1953, and there are about 2 floor plans turned in different directions, but the couple who used to live across the street from us until they both died a couple of years ago built a front porch, and their front porch happened to be there on the side of the street where it's shaded in the afternoon, and all summer long, Ruth and Leonard would sit out in the afternoon and early evening on their front porch, and everybody in the neighborhood would walk by and talk to them. Our street is a neighborhood, and it's now that they're gone, it's fizzling out because it became a neighborhood because this old couple sat on that front porch, and the neighborhood came to them. So. And that was because people still walk their dogs, for instance, and have to take their kids out in their strollers. An awful lot of people still are out on the streets somewhat, and if there's any reason for them to stop and talk to their neighbors, they're much more likely to do so. I think that in neighborhoods, even today, old neighborhoods that have those front porches, you're more likely to know your neighbors because when it's hot out, people sit out on their front porches, and if you're on the front porch, even if someone's just walking by, walking his dog or picking up trash or something, you say hi. And of course, it's certainly true that you don't do that much even if you're driving by. Someone told me once, though, that they thought it was actually not cars and not even attached garages, but garage door openers. Because before that, you'd have to, even if you've got an attached garage, you drive up, you have to get out, open the door, you're there in the neighborhood, you will see your neighbors. But when you just push a button and drive right in, close it behind you before you ever get out of the car, you can live in a neighborhood for years on end and have no idea who lives on either side of you. And that is a huge difference from the past. Yes?
That's really true because when I moved growing up in San Diego, and then I moved to Missouri, and I lived in suburbia, and everything went on in the backyard, and you had automatic garage door openers, and you had central air conditioning because of the, the heat because of the weather. I miss seeing flowers. I said, how come we don't have flowers here? And my friends in the apartment told me that, well, it's because they plant their flowers in the backyard. And something as simple as that, everything happened, if it was going to happen, it was either inside or in the backyard, and you have those automatic garage door openers, and yeah. It's very different from here because in our weather, it's much easier to be outside, and I grew up in Normal Heights with older housing stock, and I did see my neighbors on the street. And I never knew my neighbors in St. Louis. Never knew them. Nobody was ever out. They didn't play in the street or
Even kids?
they're in the backyard.
Oh. Now, usually, in my experience, kids are out in the street, even if their parents never are. But it's hot enough there that even the kids were for the mountain.
Well, when in hot weather they go in the pool in the backyard.
Yeah, that's true. You've got pools in the backyard, you got everything you need in your own backyard, you don't need to play ball in the street. But in any case, I think that it's definitely true that the orientation of the house, which once was to the street, it was an outward-looking house. You're private inside it, but you're looking to the outside. And that has really turned all the way around in our expectations of houses. Maybe it's a good thing sometimes if you don't like your neighbors. Anybody else have any questions? Well, I really appreciate you coming.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.